My daughter-in-law shoved me against the courthouse wall and screamed that I was a filthy old woman, an embarrassment to the family. She hurled these insults at me right there in front of lawyers, clerks, security guards, and countless people rushing by with folders tucked under their arms, their high heels clicking and clacking on the polished marble floor as they hurried toward their hearings. Everyone stopped dead in their tracks to stare. Valerie Logan, my own daughter-in-law, raised her voice as if she were standing in her own living room, as if I were simply some bothersome obstacle in her path. She jabbed a finger in my direction, those perfectly manicured nails gleaming with dark red polish, and repeated all the hurtful things she had been whispering to me in private for years. But this time, everything was different. This time, she chose to do it in public for all the world to see. This time, she was deliberately trying to humiliate me where it would cut the deepest. My son Charles stood just a few feet away, utterly motionless, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his impeccably tailored, expensive suit, staring intently at the floor. He didn't even bother to look up when she physically pushed me against the wall. He didn't even utter her name, a simple word, to try and stop her. I, for my part, didn't say a single thing. I didn't yell back at her. I didn't burst into tears. All I could feel was the cold, hard surface of the wall pressing against my back, the weight of all those strangers' gazes boring into me, the heavy, suffocating silence that descended after she finally finished her tirade. I took a deep, steadying breath and slowly lowered my head. I allowed them to think whatever they wanted about me. I let them believe that I was indeed that weak, pathetic woman, that voiceless old lady, that mother who simply allowed herself to be trampled on because she had absolutely nowhere else to go. But deep down inside, something fundamental shifted. Something irrevocably broke. And it wasn't my heart, surprisingly. It was the last fragile thread of hope that I had been desperately clinging to. The hope that this family still needed me, that I still mattered to them in some small way, that it was somehow still worth it for me to remain silent and endure their abuse. Valerie, in her arrogance, knew absolutely nothing about me. Charles was equally clueless. Neither of them had any idea who I truly was, what I was capable of. And in that precise moment, as she continued to spew her contempt while people around us started moving again, pretending that they hadn't witnessed anything at all, only one single thought ran through my mind. Just one. 10 minutes. In just 10 short minutes, they will all know. I am 71 years old. My name is Agnes Parker, and for 30 long years, I served as a judge in this very courthouse. But they, in their self-absorption, never knew it. I deliberately never told them. I much preferred to simply be Mom, just Grandma, just that harmless old woman who dutifully made turkey and mashed potatoes every Sunday and secretly slipped Charles a little extra money whenever he was struggling financially. That invisible woman who didn't even deserve a proper seat at the table when there were important guests present. I hid my true identity as if it were some shameful, dark secret. I deliberately concealed all of my professional achievements, my hard-earned degrees, my landmark cases, absolutely everything that defined my career. Because, in my naivete, I thought that if I made myself less imposing, if I were smaller, quieter, and simpler, then they would somehow love me more, they would truly need me more, they would finally include me more fully in their lives. How utterly wrong I was. Valerie finally finished shouting and abruptly turned away from me. She marched toward the courthouse entrance, her expensive high heels clicking sharply on the floor, her designer briefcase swinging confidently from her shoulder with the arrogant swagger of someone who is absolutely certain that they have already won. Charles wordlessly followed her without even glancing back at me, without offering a single apology, without saying anything at all. I remained standing there for a few more seconds, trying to compose myself. I took another deep breath, attempting to regain my composure. I smoothed down the front of the plain beige sweater I was wearing, the one that Valerie always made a point of saying made me look even older than I already was. I ran a trembling hand over my naturally gray hair, the hair that she had repeatedly suggested I dye because it gave such a bad impression. And then, finally, I walked purposefully toward the courthouse entrance, but I deliberately didn't go through the main doors. I refused to walk meekly behind them like some obedient dog. I refused to hide myself away in a dark corner like they clearly expected me to. Instead, I confidently took the side hallway, the one that only those of us who actually worked here used on a daily basis, the one that led directly to the private offices, to the quiet deliberation rooms, to the small changing rooms where we kept our judicial robes. I walked down that hallway in complete silence, my head held high. I nodded politely to Patricia, the court clerk who had been working here faithfully for the past 20 years. She smiled warmly at me. She casually asked if I was feeling ready for today's particularly complex case. I told her yes, I was more than ready. I walked purposefully into the changing room. I quickly took off the frumpy beige sweater that Valerie so despised. I also took off the sensible, flat shoes that Valerie had once dismissively said looked like something a poor old lady would wear. I carefully put on the crisp black robe, the one that was hanging neatly in the closet with my name professionally embroidered on the inside lining. Agnes Parker, Judge, Courtroom 3. I took a long, hard look at myself in the mirror. 71 years old, naturally gray hair, deep wrinkles etched around my eyes, hands that trembled slightly, not from any fear, but from a deep sense of anticipation. I carefully put on the reading glasses that I only ever used for poring over lengthy, complicated legal documents. I straightened the robe and walked purposefully out of the changing room. I walked down the long hallway that led directly to Courtroom 3, the one where the official portraits of all the esteemed judges who had served here since 1950 were prominently hung. My own portrait was there, too, the third painting from the left. But they, in their monumental indifference, had never even noticed it. They had never bothered to ask. They simply never cared enough to even look. I finally reached the heavy courtroom door. I pushed it open slowly and deliberately. The uniformed security guard held it open a little wider for me with a respectful nod. Inside, people were already seated, waiting expectantly. Lawyers, witnesses, various family members. And then, in the very first row on the right side of the courtroom, there she was, Valerie Logan, sitting ramrod straight, intently reviewing some papers, talking quietly with her young assistant, exuding an air of supreme confidence, absolutely sure of herself, completely ready to win her case. Charles was sitting 2 rows directly behind her, just watching the proceedings, passively waiting, still completely oblivious to what was about to happen. I entered the courtroom through the side door, the one that led directly to the elevated judge's bench. I deliberately walked up the 3 polished wooden steps. I sat down in the high-back chair, the one that had my name subtly engraved on a small, elegant plaque on the back. I carefully placed my hands flat on the polished wooden desk in front of me. I took a deep, steadying breath and deliberately waited. The low murmur of voices in the crowded room continued for a few more seconds, until someone finally looked up and noticed me, until someone finally realized what was happening, until the silence started to spread slowly throughout the room like a powerful wave. Valerie still hadn't seen me. She was still deeply engrossed in reviewing her legal papers, talking and laughing softly with her assistant, so completely focused on her own little world that she didn't even notice that the entire room had gradually fallen silent and completely stopped moving. Then, finally, the court clerk stood up abruptly. He cleared his throat loudly and deliberately said aloud what everyone in the courtroom was now waiting to hear. All rise. The Honorable Judge Agnes Parker will preside over this hearing. Valerie looked up slowly and deliberately, as if she hadn't heard the words correctly, as if the announcement simply made absolutely no sense to her. Her eyes frantically scanned the entire room, searching desperately, trying to understand what was happening, until her gaze finally landed on me. She saw me sitting there on the bench, wearing the formal black robe, with my reading glasses perched on my nose, with the exact same face that she had so viciously insulted just 10 minutes earlier out by the courthouse door. Her entire face visibly changed in an instant. First utter confusion, then disbelief, then sheer unadulterated panic. Her mouth opened slightly in shock. Her trembling hands dropped all the papers she had been holding. And for the first time in all the years that I had known her, Valerie Logan was completely and utterly speechless. I didn't smile smugly. I didn't make any dramatic gesture. I simply stared calmly back at her, maintaining the same icy composure that I had managed to maintain outside when she had physically pushed me, when she had hurled insults at me, when she had treated me like a piece of worthless trash. Charles finally saw me, too. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair over in the process. His face reflected an array of emotions that I had never seen there before. Raw fear, deep shame, complete and utter confusion. But I deliberately didn't give them any time to process what was happening. I didn't give them any time to react. I picked up the heavy wooden gavel that was sitting on my right. I raised it high above my head and then brought it down sharply against the desk with a loud, resounding bang that echoed throughout the entire courtroom. This court is now in session. Everyone in the courtroom immediately stood up respectfully. The whole room rose to its feet. Everyone, that is, except for Valerie. She was still sitting there completely paralyzed, her eyes fixed on me as if she were seeing a ghost. I kept my gaze fixed forward, professional, cold, exactly as I had done for the past 30 years of my career, exactly as I should have done with them from the very beginning. This is case number 2025-037. Attorney Valerie Logan represents the plaintiff. Are you ready to proceed? Silence. Valerie didn't answer. She simply couldn't. She kept staring at me blankly as if the entire world had suddenly turned upside down. Attorney Logan, I asked if you were ready to proceed. She blinked rapidly. She swallowed hard. She tried desperately to speak, but her voice came out cracked and broken. Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor. That same woman who had just called me a filthy old woman 10 minutes earlier was now addressing me as Your Honor. That same woman who had physically pushed me against a wall was now trembling nervously in front of me. And I, Agnes Parker, 71 years old, Charles's mother, grandmother of 2 beautiful little girls who barely even knew me, could only think of one single thing as I watched her crumble before my very eyes. It's just beginning. There was a time when I sincerely believed that being a mother was enough, that being a grandmother was a precious gift, that my place in this family was permanently secured simply by existing, by having given them life, by having always been there for them every single time they needed me. But things, unfortunately, just don't work that way in the real world. Not when your children grow up and completely forget where they came from. Not when they marry people who slowly but surely turn them into unrecognizable strangers. Charles was born when I was just 26 years old. His father, Michael, was a genuinely good man. Hardworking, honest, and loving. He tragically died of a sudden heart attack when Charles was only 15 years old. I was left all alone with a teenage son to raise, with a house that we were still struggling to pay off, with a mountain of bills that never seemed to stop coming. But I absolutely refused to give up. I worked grueling double shifts for years on end, sacrificing everything for my son. I somehow managed to finish my demanding law studies while Charles was fast asleep. I studied diligently at the kitchen table until 3 o'clock in the morning, with a lukewarm cup of coffee always by my side and law books scattered haphazardly all over the place. I finally graduated with honors, defying all the odds. I quickly got a demanding job at the prosecutor's office. I diligently climbed the ranks, slowly but surely. I became a judge at the relatively young age of 42. I did absolutely everything for him, all so that I could give him a better life, so he could attend a good university, so he wouldn't ever have to want for anything. And Charles, to his credit, actually succeeded in life. He graduated as a lawyer. He opened his own successful law firm. He started making a lot of money. A lot of money, indeed. I was so incredibly proud of him. So proud that it almost physically hurt. I looked at my son, wearing expensive, impeccably tailored suits, driving a brand new luxury car, eating at fancy restaurants that I had never even heard of, let alone been to. And I truly thought that all of my hard work had finally been worth it, that all those long years of sacrifice had ultimately paid off in the end. Then, one fateful day, he met Valerie. The very first time I laid eyes on her was at a Thanksgiving dinner. Charles brought her unannounced, without any prior warning. She arrived wearing a tight, revealing black dress, ridiculously high heels, and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. Pure contempt. She sat at my humble table. She looked around my modest house with an expression that she couldn't completely hide, as if she were secretly evaluating every single piece of old furniture, every faded curtain, every chipped plate that I had been using faithfully for decades. I graciously served her the Thanksgiving dinner that I had lovingly prepared with my own 2 hands. Roasted chicken with creamy mashed potatoes and a simple salad. Nothing fancy. Nothing particularly sophisticated. Just good, old-fashioned homemade food made with love. Valerie barely even took 2 bites of her meal. She politely said that it was absolutely delicious, but that she was currently watching her figure. Charles didn't say anything at all. He just quietly ate his dinner in silence while she incessantly talked about her demanding work, her important clients, and all the high-profile cases that she had single-handedly won. That night, as they were leaving, I distinctly overheard Valerie talking to Charles out by the front door. She wasn't exactly yelling, but her voice was clear and sharp, cutting through the silence like a shard of glass. Cold. Your mother still lives in this tiny little house. Can't you possibly do something about that, Charles? It gives a really bad impression. People will think that you simply don't care. Charles mumbled something unintelligible under his breath. But he didn't defend her. He certainly didn't defend me. And I, standing silently on the other side of the closed door, my hands still wet and soapy from washing the seemingly endless pile of dishes, felt something deep inside me slowly start to break. But I quickly told myself that it was just a first impression, that Valerie was probably nervous, that things would undoubtedly get better over time, that she just needed to get to know me a little better. How utterly naive I was back then. They got married a mere 6 months later. A big, ostentatious wedding held in a fancy ballroom that cost well over $50,000. I didn't offer my opinion on anything. They certainly didn't ask for my opinion. They simply informed me of the date and the location of the wedding. I sat quietly in the 3rd row during the actual ceremony, directly behind Valerie's important friends and all of Charles's pompous law firm partners, feeling like just another random guest, like someone who really didn't matter at all. After the lavish wedding, things started to subtly change for the worse. Charles started visiting me less and less frequently. The phone calls gradually became shorter and shorter. The cherished Sunday lunches that we used to regularly share slowly but surely disappeared altogether. There was always some convenient excuse. Work, travel, social commitments. And when he did occasionally come to visit, Valerie invariably came along with him. Always hypercritical. Always quick to point out everything that was wrong with my humble house. The walls desperately needed a fresh coat of paint. The furniture was outdated and tacky. The yard was terribly neglected. I should really hire someone to help me out with the cleaning. I should definitely move to a smaller, more manageable place. I should do this. I should do that. I should. She never once bothered to ask how I was actually doing. She never once asked if I needed anything at all. She only pointed out my perceived flaws, as if they were glaringly obvious to absolutely everyone. Charles, meanwhile, didn't say anything in my defense. He just sat passively on the sofa, looking intently at his cell phone, nodding distractedly while she launched into one of her endless tirades. And I just smiled weakly. I nodded politely. I thanked her profusely for her advice, even though it secretly hurt me deeply because I desperately thought that if I simply showed myself to be docile and agreeable, if I made myself small and insignificant, if I didn't cause any problems whatsoever, then they would continue to come around. Then I would somehow still be a part of their increasingly distant lives. But each and every visit was demonstrably worse than the last. Each barbed comment was more deeply hurtful. Each strained silence from Charles was heavier and more suffocating than before. Then, finally, the girls were born. Natalie first. 2 years later, Olivia. My precious granddaughters, 2 beautiful little creatures with Charles's piercing blue eyes and Michael's warm, infectious smile. I naively thought that everything would finally change for the better. I dared to hope that being a grandmother would give me a new and important place in the family, a renewed sense of purpose, a compelling reason for them to finally need me again. But Valerie steadfastly refused to let me see them. There was always some carefully constructed excuse. The girls were feeling sick. They had extracurricular activities that they needed to attend. They were simply too tired to see anyone. Valerie much preferred them to spend time with her own mother, the other grandmother, who lived in a sprawling mansion with a sparkling swimming pool and a full staff of servants. I lovingly sent them thoughtful gifts on their birthdays, carefully chosen dolls, age-appropriate books, and stylish clothes. But I never once received a simple thank you call. I never even saw any photos of them happily wearing the clothes that I had so painstakingly selected for them. Just complete and utter silence. One day, I finally plucked up all of my courage and tentatively asked Charles if I could possibly take the girls to the park for a little while. Just for a few short hours, just so I could finally get to know them a little better, so they would at least know who their grandmother actually was. Charles was silent for a long, awkward moment. Then he vaguely said that he would talk to Valerie about it. But that crucial conversation clearly never actually happened. Or, if it did, the answer was undoubtedly no, because he never mentioned it to me again. And I, in my self-imposed silence, didn't dare to insist, because I desperately didn't want to be perceived as annoying or bothersome. I absolutely didn't want to be that type of mother-in-law who constantly causes problems for everyone. The years inexorably passed. I quietly retired from the courthouse at the age of 68. 30 long years of dedicated service, hundreds of complicated cases presided over, thousands of consequential decisions that had profoundly changed people's lives for the better. But on the actual day of my official retirement ceremony, Charles, predictably, didn't even bother to show up. He casually said that he had an important hearing that he absolutely couldn't miss. Valerie didn't even bother to respond to my congratulatory text message. I went home all alone that afternoon with a commemorative plaque tucked under my arm and a hastily arranged bouquet of flowers that my kind colleagues had thoughtfully given me. With a heart so heavy with disappointment that I could barely even breathe. And there, sitting alone in my eerily empty living room, sadly looking at the worn-out walls that Valerie had so often criticized for needing a fresh coat of paint, I quietly made a firm decision. I absolutely wouldn't tell them that I had been a judge for the past 3 decades. I wouldn't tell them anything at all about my long and distinguished legal career. I certainly wouldn't show them any of my impressive professional achievements. Because if 30 long years of hard work and dedicated public service hadn't been enough to compel Charles to attend my retirement ceremony, then absolutely nothing would. I would simply be Mom, just Grandma. Just that simple old woman who lived quietly in a small house and didn't bother anyone too much. But that carefully considered decision came with a steep price, because the more deliberately invisible I tried to make myself, the more carelessly they treated me as if I simply didn't even exist. Family gatherings at Charles's house became increasingly frequent. Elegant dinner parties, lavish birthday parties for the girls, sophisticated get-togethers with their important friends. But I was consistently never invited to any of them. I often only found out about them completely by chance, from a carelessly posted photo on social media, or from a thoughtless comment that Charles had accidentally let slip during one of our increasingly rare phone conversations. Once, I actually showed up unannounced at one of those exclusive parties. It was Natalie's 8th birthday. My sweet granddaughter was turning 8 years old. I rang the doorbell with a carefully wrapped gift in my hands, a beautifully illustrated storybook that I had spent weeks searching for in different bookstores. Valerie predictably opened the door. She insolently looked me up and down. She pointedly refused to let me inside. "Agnes, I had no idea that you were planning on coming. This is just for close family and Natalie's friends. There's really no room at the table." "But I am family," I protested gently. "I am her grandmother." Valerie forced a smile. Cold, calculated smile. "Of course you are, but the child really doesn't know you very well. We don't want her to feel uncomfortable at her own birthday party." And with that, she casually closed the door directly in my face. I stood there all alone at the front entrance, clutching the carefully chosen gift in my trembling hands, sadly listening to the sounds of laughter coming from inside. Children's innocent laughter, cheerful music, pure, unadulterated happiness. Everything just on the other side of that firmly closed door. I slowly walked back to my quiet house. I didn't bother to take a taxi. I didn't even think to call anyone for support. I just quietly walked the 15 long blocks back home with the precious book tucked tightly under my arm and silent tears streaming uncontrollably down my face. That night, I couldn't help but wonder what I had done so terribly wrong. At what precise point had I irrevocably lost my own son? At what specific point had I simply stopped mattering to him? But I could find no easy answers. Only a huge, gaping void that seemed to grow bigger and more terrifying every single day. 2 more long years slowly passed. Things, predictably, didn't get any better. In fact, they only got demonstrably worse. Charles stopped visiting me completely. The already infrequent phone calls were now reduced to a mere one every 2 months. Brief, 5-minute conversations where he casually asked if I was doing okay, and I, in turn, routinely said yes, even though it simply wasn't true. Then, 6 months ago, I stumbled upon something that abruptly changed absolutely everything. Something that finally woke me up from the silent, living nightmare that I had been trapped in for so long. It was completely accidental. Charles came to my house because he urgently needed some old documents that I was still keeping safely stored away. His late father's valuable life insurance papers. He came in a terrible hurry as usual. He carelessly left his cell phone on the kitchen table while he was frantically searching in the study for the elusive paperwork, and the phone happened to ring. It was a new text message. The screen lit up brightly, and I inadvertently saw what it said. It was from Valerie. I already spoke to the attorney. We can easily have her declared legally incompetent in just 6 months. The house is worth at least $200,000. We can sell it and just keep all the money. She can easily go to a cheap nursing home. She won't even realize it. I obsessively read that appalling text message 3 times. 4 times. 5 times. The cruel, calculated letters burned deeply into my eyes as if they were made of fire. I simply couldn't breathe. Couldn't even move my fingers. I could only stand silently there, completely transfixed, staring blankly at that brightly illuminated screen, at those cold, heartless words that had just shattered what little was left of my precarious world. Declare her incompetent, as if I were some inanimate object to be casually discarded. As if at 71 years old I no longer had a mind of my own. As if I couldn't possibly make my own rational decisions. As if I were just a burdensome inconvenience that needed to be quickly and guiltlessly gotten rid of. The house is worth $200,000. That very same house where I had lovingly raised Charles, where I had openly cried over Michael's untimely death, where I had spent countless sleepless nights diligently studying to become a judge, where I kept every precious memory of my long and eventful life. That very same house that I had painstakingly paid for with my own hard work, with my own tireless efforts, with my own 2 hands. And now they wanted to casually sell it, greedily keep all of the money for themselves, and unceremoniously send me to some dreadful nursing home as if I were nothing more than worthless trash. I heard Charles's heavy footsteps returning quickly from the study. I instinctively picked up his cell phone and carefully placed it exactly where it had been. I quickly wiped away my silent tears with the back of my trembling hand. I took a deep, calming breath, and when he casually walked back into the kitchen with the long-sought insurance papers clutched tightly in his hand, I was calmly pouring myself a cup of coffee as if absolutely nothing had happened. Thanks, Mom. I really have to run. Meeting in half an hour. Of course, son. Drive safely. He gave me a quick kiss on the forehead. A fleeting kiss, automatic and completely meaningless. He grabbed his phone. He quickly left. And I just stood there silently in my kitchen, the fragile coffee cup trembling precariously in my hand, feeling the solid ground slowly disappear from beneath my feet. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat alone in the darkened living room with the lights off, staring silently into the inky blackness, desperately trying to process everything that I had just read, trying to somehow understand how my own flesh and blood son could even possibly contemplate doing something so unbelievably cruel, how he could so callously plan out my entire life without ever consulting me, without even bothering to ask me, without even having the basic decency to look me directly in the eye. But I already knew the heartbreaking answer. Charles was no longer the loving son that I had raised. He wasn't the sweet little boy who cried inconsolably in my arms whenever he had terrible nightmares. He certainly wasn't the vulnerable teenager who tearfully hugged me tightly whenever he desperately missed his deceased father. That sweet, innocent Charles had sadly disappeared many years ago, replaced by a hollow man who only ever looked forward towards money, towards social status, towards whatever Valerie constantly told him to look at. And Valerie, that cold, calculating woman who had entered my life like a silent, destructive storm and completely destroyed everything in her path. She was the real architect of all of my profound pain. The one who constantly whispered poisonous lies into my son's impressionable ear. The one who effortlessly turned me into the enemy every single time I dared to open my mouth. But there was one crucial thing that she simply didn't know about me. Something that Charles, in his self-absorbed arrogance, didn't know either. I wasn't a defenseless old woman who was simply going to passively let herself be trampled on without putting up a fight. I certainly wasn't a helpless woman without resources, without intelligence, and without any real power. For 30 long years I was a judge. I tirelessly resolved complicated cases of inheritance disputes, of egregious fraud, of insidious family manipulation. I regularly saw children betraying their own parents, wives shamelessly stealing from their unsuspecting husbands, and entire families viciously destroying themselves over money and greed. And I learned one absolutely fundamental lesson. The law, ultimately, does not forgive those who consciously act with malice. And justice, when applied correctly and impartially, can and will change absolutely everything. The very next morning, I promptly called my trusted attorney, Lizzie Oliver, a man I had gratefully met some 20 years earlier when I had presided fairly over his complicated case. He had been unjustly accused of serious fraud. The incriminating evidence had been flimsy at best. The prosecution had been in a terrible hurry to convict him. But I had painstakingly taken the time to carefully review every single document and every piece of relevant testimony, and I had ultimately discovered that he was, in fact, completely innocent. I had honorably acquitted him of all charges. I had given him a much-deserved second chance at life. And he had never once forgotten my quiet act of judicial kindness. Every single year on the specific date of the official verdict, he faithfully sent me a heartfelt card thanking me profusely for my unwavering support. Every Christmas, I invariably received a thoughtful fruit basket accompanied by a personalized handwritten note. And when I had quietly retired from the courthouse, he was one of the very few people who had actually bothered to attend my otherwise sparsely attended retirement ceremony. Louis answered my urgent phone call on only the second ring. "Mrs. Parker, what a pleasant surprise. How are you doing?" "I desperately need your help, Louis. It's urgent." We promptly met in his small but efficient office that very same afternoon. I painstakingly told him everything, the appalling text message that I had inadvertently seen on Charles's phone, the long years of constant contempt, Valerie's insidious plan to have me declared legally incompetent against my will. Louis thoughtfully listened in complete silence, diligently taking careful notes and shaking his head slowly in obvious disapproval. When I finally finished, he deliberately put his pen down on the cluttered desk and looked directly at me with those dark, knowing eyes that had clearly seen far too much of the world's inherent darkness. "Mrs. Parker, this is undeniably serious, but we absolutely have options and we still have some precious time. If they are seriously going to try to have you declared legally incompetent, they will inevitably need substantial medical evidence, extensive psychological evaluations, and convincing witness testimonies. They simply can't legally do it overnight." "I know that, Louis, but I simply don't want to passively wait for them to actually try to do it. I need to proactively protect myself. I want to make absolutely certain that when the time inevitably comes, they won't even have a chance of succeeding." Louis nodded slowly in agreement. "Then we are going to proactively bulletproof you legally, medically, and emotionally. We are immediately going to get comprehensive evaluations of your overall mental health and official certificates of your current cognitive capacity. We are going to carefully revise your existing will, and we are going to meticulously make absolutely certain that no one, and I mean absolutely no one, can ever possibly touch you without your explicit consent." And that is precisely what we did. For, in the weeks that followed, I was subjected to neurological evaluations, memory tests, and exhaustive psychological exams. The results came back spotless. My cognitive functions were perfectly healthy. My decision-making ability was completely intact. Any judge reviewing those documents would come to the same conclusion. There was simply no basis to declare me incompetent. Louis also handled the revision of my will. We essentially started from scratch and completely rewrote it. Charles remained my heir, but with significant stipulations. He was forbidden from selling the house without my explicit authorization. He couldn't make any decisions regarding my health care without my express consent, and he wouldn't receive a single penny until the moment of my death. Furthermore, if he even attempted to manipulate my will while I was still alive, he would forfeit everything. I signed each and every document with a steady hand, without a moment's hesitation, and without shedding a single tear. This wasn't about succumbing to pain anymore. This was purely and simply about survival. But I didn't stop there. I decided to launch my own investigation. Louis hired a private investigator, a discreet and seasoned professional who had worked on similar cases in the past. We tasked him with monitoring Valerie's activities, scrutinizing her finances, reviewing her legal history, and tracking her movements. The information he uncovered was far more disturbing than I could have ever imagined. It turned out that Valerie had been systematically siphoning money from the firm she shared with Charles. The initial amounts were relatively small, perhaps $500 here, $1,000 there, but over time the sums grew exponentially. $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 vanished into thin air, funneled into shadowy, non-existent accounts. Charles either knew nothing about it or was intentionally feigning ignorance, but the evidence was irrefutable. There were clear transfer records, incriminating receipts, and email exchanges where Valerie discussed with her accountant the best ways to conceal the money and disguise it as legitimate operating expenses. We also discovered that Valerie was drowning in debt, burdened by massive credit card balances exceeding $30,000, unpaid personal loans, and, worst of all, she had secretly mortgaged the house she shared with Charles without his knowledge or consent. She had even gone as far as to forge his signature on the loan documents. She used the firm's letterhead and resources to make the whole scheme appear legitimate. That woman was clearly desperate, and my house, my inheritance, represented her only chance of salvation. That was the real reason she was so eager to have me declared incompetent. That was why she was pushing to sell the house as quickly as possible. She desperately needed the money before her entire house of cards came crashing down around her. Louis meticulously compiled all the evidence into a comprehensive and damning dossier. It contained irrefutable proof of fraud, undeniable evidence of forgery, and clear-cut proof of embezzlement. It was more than enough to completely destroy Valerie's professional reputation and land her in serious legal trouble. But I wasn't ready to unleash it just yet. Not immediately, anyway. There was something else I wanted, something far more important to me than merely achieving legal justice. I wanted them to finally understand who I truly was. I wanted them to see me, to really see me, not as the annoying, doddering old woman who was inconveniencing their perfect lives, but as the woman I had always been, the accomplished judge, the seasoned professional, the one who had successfully resolved cases far more complex and challenging than anything they had ever encountered. Louis regarded me with a mixture of curiosity and concern when I shared my plan with him. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Mrs. Parker? This could be incredibly risky. If they suspect something is amiss beforehand, they might alter their strategy." "I'm sure, Louis. Trust me. I know exactly what I'm doing." And yes, I truly did know because I had dedicated the last 3 decades of my life to precisely this kind of endeavor. Carefully planning, meticulously strategizing, and patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Louis made a few strategic phone calls. He contacted his network of associates at the courthouse. He inquired about upcoming cases in which Valerie was involved as an attorney. And he managed to find one. A significant case, a high-profile matter, one that Valerie had been diligently preparing for over several months. It involved a complex commercial dispute, one company suing another for breach of contract. The stakes were incredibly high, amounting to $500,000. Valerie was representing the plaintiff, and she absolutely needed to win because if she lost, her professional reputation would be irreparably tarnished. Clients would begin to lose faith in her abilities, and with her mountain of debt, she simply couldn't afford that kind of setback. The hearing was scheduled to take place in 3 weeks, on a Tuesday morning in courtroom 3 of the courthouse. Louis grinned as he delivered the news. "Guess who has been assigned as the presiding judge for that particular case?" I couldn't help but smile too. the first genuine smile I had experienced in months. A real smile, one that emanated from some deep, long-dormant place within me. "Tell me, Patricia, your former clerk. She's the one handling the judicial assignments now, and when she saw the details of the case, she thought you might be interested in returning, just this once as a visiting judge, a special favor." "Patricia did that?" "Yes, she always held you in very high regard, Mrs. Parker, and when I hinted at what was happening, without divulging all the specifics, she understood completely. She said it would be an absolute honor to have you back, even if it was just for a single day." I accepted. Of course, I accepted without hesitation because this was so much more than just another legal case. This was the moment I had been anticipating, the moment when everything was about to change. I devoted the next 3 weeks to meticulous preparation. I reviewed every single document related to the case, every argument presented, every relevant legal precedent. I made absolutely certain that I knew every minute detail even better than the attorneys involved. I also prepared myself emotionally because I knew that when Valerie finally saw me sitting in that judge's chair, when Charles finally understood the true nature of his mother, everything was going to explode. And I needed to be fully prepared for the fallout. I needed to be strong. I needed to maintain an outward appearance of calm and composure, even if I was trembling with anxiety on the inside. The night before the hearing, I found myself completely unable to sleep. I remained awake for hours, staring blankly at the ceiling, mentally rehearsing every word I planned to say, every gesture I intended to make. I thought about Michael, how incredibly proud he would have been, how he would have embraced me tightly and reassured me that I was doing the right thing. And I thought about Charles, both the innocent, loving boy he once was and the calculating, estranged man he had become. And I couldn't help but wonder if there was still anything left of the son I loved deep down inside that stranger who was plotting to have me locked away. At precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, I finally forced myself out of bed. I took a shower. I dressed in simple, unassuming clothes. A plain beige sweater, dark, comfortable pants, and practical flat shoes. I intentionally wanted to look exactly as they expected me to, fragile, insignificant, and essentially invisible. I hailed a taxi to the courthouse. I made sure to arrive early. I stood outside for a moment, gazing up at that imposing building where I had spent so many years of my life, where I had made pivotal decisions that had irrevocably altered countless destinies, where I had been someone of consequence. And then, I saw them arrive. Charles appeared first, impeccably dressed in his customary gray suit, carrying his expensive leather briefcase, and wearing his perpetually serious expression. Trailing slightly behind him was Valerie, sporting a sleek black dress, towering high heels, and that arrogant, self-satisfied smile that I knew all too well. They didn't notice me at first. They were walking quickly, deeply engrossed in conversation. Valerie was saying something about the case, about how she was planning to completely obliterate the opposing party, about how this resounding triumph would undoubtedly open countless important doors for them. Then they finally saw me and everything abruptly changed. Valerie came to an immediate and complete halt when she spotted me standing near the courthouse entrance. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe with that familiar look of thinly veiled contempt. Charles averted his gaze, looking uncomfortable, as he always did when he knew something was wrong but didn't want to directly confront it. "Agnes, what are you doing here?" It wasn't a genuine question. It was more of an accusatory statement, as if I had no right whatsoever to be in that public space, as if my mere presence somehow constituted a personal offense. "Good morning, Valerie." "Good morning, Charles." My voice was calm, serene, and precisely as I had practiced it to be. Charles mumbled a barely audible greeting in response. Valerie didn't even bother to acknowledge me. She simply stared at me with those cold, calculating eyes that seemed to be estimating how long it would take her to get rid of me. "Do you have some paperwork to file or something? Because if you need help with something legal, you can always go somewhere else. We have an extremely important hearing to attend." I smiled, a small, controlled smile. "I know. Good luck with your case." Valerie frowned, looking confused, likely wondering how I had even known about her case in the first place. But I didn't give her any time to ask. I turned around and began to walk purposefully toward the entrance. And then it happened. Valerie caught up to me in a matter of 3 swift strides. She grabbed my arm forcefully. Her fingers dug into my skin like sharp claws. "Wait, why are you really here? Did you come here to harass us? Did you come here to make us look bad in front of important people?" Her voice grew louder and more shrill with each word. People began to turn around and stare, lawyers, clerks, security guards, all becoming unwilling witnesses to the scene that was about to unfold. "Valerie, please let go of me. No, I want to know what you're doing here. You always show up where you're not wanted. Always getting in the way, always ruining everything." She shoved me roughly, not hard enough to knock me completely off my feet, but enough to make me stumble backward against the solid wall. My back collided with the cold concrete. A sharp pain shot through my old bones. Charles was still standing there, about 10 feet away, passively watching the entire scene unfold, doing absolutely nothing to intervene. "You're an embarrassment, Agnes. A filthy old woman who doesn't even know when to just disappear. Look at you wearing those horrible clothes with that unkempt hair. You're pitiful. You're an embarrassment even to your own son. That's why we never invite you to anything, because you embarrass us." The words spewed from her mouth like venom, each one stabbing me directly in the chest. But I refused to respond. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply stared at her, carefully memorizing every single detail of her face, every cruel gesture, because I knew that in just a few short minutes, all of that would change. Valerie finally released my arm with a final, contemptuous shove. She shook her hands as if she had just touched something disgustingly dirty. Charles finally approached, but not to help me. He walked directly to Valerie. He placed his hand reassuringly on her shoulder, a gesture of support, a display of complicity. "Let's go, Valerie. We're going to be late." She nodded in agreement. She cast one last look of utter contempt in my direction, and then they both turned and walked toward the courthouse entrance without ever looking back. I remained standing there for a few more seconds, taking deep breaths, feeling the stinging sensation on my cheek where her hand had struck me, feeling the lingering pain in my back where it had impacted against the unforgiving wall, feeling every single cell in my body screaming for justice. Then I finally moved, but not through the main entrance, not following after them. I instead took the side hallway, the one that was exclusively reserved for judges, the one that led directly to the private chambers. Patricia was already there, waiting for me. She rushed to embrace me the moment she saw me. "Mrs. Parker, you're trembling. Are you okay?" "I'm perfectly fine, Patricia. Thank you for this. For everything." She led me into the changing room. She helped me take off the plain beige sweater. She reached into the closet and retrieved the black robe that was hanging there with my name embroidered on it. "Agnes Parker, Judge." I slowly put it on, feeling the familiar weight of the fabric, feeling something deep inside me begin to awaken after years of being dormant. It wasn't simply revenge that I felt. It was dignity. It was a powerful reminder of who I had always been, who I still was, despite everything that had happened. Patricia looked at me with tears welling up in her eyes. "We miss you terribly here, Mrs. Parker. This place just isn't the same without you." "I've missed you all too." I adjusted the robe. I put on my reading glasses. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. 71 years old, gray hair, wrinkles that told silent stories of both profound pain and incredible resilience, but also unwavering strength, enduring wisdom, and undeniable power. "I'm ready." Patricia walked me to the door of courtroom 3. Before I entered, she squeezed my hand tightly. "Make them understand who you truly are, Mrs. Parker. Make them see." "I will." I pushed the door open. The security guard greeted me with respect. He opened the way for me, and I entered that familiar courtroom, a place I knew by heart, a place where I had spent thousands upon thousands of hours, a place where I had dramatically altered lives with my carefully considered decisions. The room was completely full. Valerie was sitting in the front row, meticulously reviewing her documents, talking intently with her assistant, radiating an air of supreme confidence, completely certain of her imminent victory. Charles was seated further back, alone, waiting passively, completely oblivious to the earth-shattering events that were about to unfold. I ascended the 3 steps to the bench. I sat down in the high-backed chair. I placed my hands deliberately on the desk. I took a deep breath and I waited. The low murmur of conversation continued until someone looked up and noticed me, until the silence began to slowly spread like an insidious oil slick. Valerie still hadn't seen me, completely engrossed in her documents, secure in her perfect little world that was about to come crashing down. The court clerk stood up abruptly. He cleared his throat loudly. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Agnes Parker will preside over this hearing." And that was the exact moment when Valerie finally looked up. When she saw me, when her entire world seemed to stop spinning, Valerie's face cycled through a dizzying array of emotions in a matter of mere seconds. First, utter confusion, then complete disbelief, then unadulterated panic. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The papers she was clutching tightly in her hands slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor with a dry, rustling sound that echoed loudly in the absolute silence of the courtroom. Charles stood up so quickly and violently that his chair tipped backward and crashed to the floor behind him. His face had completely lost all color. He stared at me as if he were seeing a ghost, as if the world, as he knew it, had just shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. I didn't say a single word yet. I simply observed them both calmly, maintaining the same outward serenity I had cultivated for the past 30 years in this very place. The same serenity I had always used to confront aggressive lawyers, lying witnesses, and seemingly impossible cases. The clerk spoke again, his voice cutting sharply through the heavy silence. "All rise to receive your honor." The entire courtroom stood up in unison, everyone except Valerie. She remained seated, completely paralyzed, her eyes fixed on me as if she simply couldn't process what she was seeing. Her assistant had to touch her tentatively on the shoulder twice before she finally reacted and stood up on trembling legs. "Good morning. Please be seated." My voice came out firm, clear, and exactly as it should be. The room immediately obeyed. The soft rustling sound of bodies settling back into their chairs filled the space for a moment. I opened the folder in front of me. Case number 2025-037. Valley Construction Company versus Catadillo Urban Developments. Contractual dispute over breach of clauses. Amount claimed $500,000. I looked up. Attorney Valerie Logan represents the plaintiff. Attorney Cesar Vallejo represents the defendant. Are both parties present and ready to proceed? The defense attorney answered immediately and confidently. "Yes, Your Honor." Valerie was still completely silent. Her assistant nudged her discreetly. She blinked rapidly. She swallowed hard. She tried to speak, but her voice came out broken and barely audible. Yes. Excuse me. Attorney Logan, I didn't hear you. Are you ready to proceed? My tone was professional, neutral, exactly the same one I used with any attorney who appeared before me. But my eyes were locked directly on hers, and she knew. She knew that I knew. She knew that this was no mere coincidence. "Yes, Your Honor, I am ready." "Excellent. Then let us begin. Attorney Logan, present your opening arguments." Valerie stood up. Her hands trembled noticeably as she gathered the scattered papers from the floor. Some of them slipped from her grasp and fell again. Her assistant bent down to help her retrieve them. The entire courtroom watched, some with undisguised curiosity, others with palpable discomfort. Everyone sensed that something was profoundly out of place. Valerie finally managed to stand in front of the bench. She took a deep breath, attempting to regain that characteristic arrogant confidence that usually defined her, but she couldn't quite manage it. Her voice came out insecure and choppy. "Your Honor, my client Valley Construction Company signed a contract with Cedillo Urban Developments for a value of $1,200,000. I stopped her there. I raised my hand slightly. "Excuse me, Attorney Logan. According to the documents that I have in front of me, the contract was actually for $1,500,000, not $1,200,000. Valerie paled even further. She frantically searched through her papers. "You are absolutely right, Your Honor. I made a mistake. Please continue. She attempted to continue with her opening argument, but her concentration was completely shattered. She misstated dates. She cited incorrect clauses. She forgot fundamental details that any competent lawyer should know by heart in a case that she had supposedly prepared for months. I corrected her every single time, patiently, professionally, but also firmly, exactly as I would with any lawyer who came unprepared to my courtroom. Charles was still sitting in the back of the courtroom. I saw him out of the corner of my eye. His head was buried in his hands. His world was rapidly collapsing. Everything he thought he knew about his mother, about his life, about reality itself, was falling apart before his very eyes. After about 20 minutes of increasingly disastrous arguments, I stopped her again. Valerie, Attorney Logan, I see that you are having considerable difficulty presenting your arguments coherently. Do you perhaps need a recess? No, Your Honor, I can continue. Are you absolutely sure? Because if you are not adequately prepared for this case, I am certainly willing to postpone the hearing. I saw the naked panic in her eyes. Postponing the hearing meant admitting incompetence. It meant that her client would lose all confidence in her. It meant the potential end of her career and her already precarious reputation. I am prepared, Your Honor. Then I strongly suggest that you focus on the pertinent facts and stop wasting this court's valuable time with such basic errors. Yes, Your Honor. The utter humiliation on her face was painfully evident. That woman who had called me a filthy old woman less than an hour ago was now being publicly reprimanded by me in front of a packed courtroom full of legal professionals. That woman who had physically pushed me against a cold, unforgiving wall was now visibly trembling under the weight of my gaze. But I didn't feel any sense of satisfaction. Not yet, anyway. This wasn't about personal revenge. This was about administering justice. This was about finally showing them who I truly was. Not the weak, pathetic mother they thought they knew. Not the doddering old woman who was simply in their way, but the respected professional, the accomplished judge who had earned her rightful place through hard work, unwavering dedication, and sheer perseverance. Valerie finally finished her opening argument. She sat down heavily, her face flushed with shame. Her assistant whispered something urgently in her ear, but she didn't respond. She just stared straight ahead with a completely empty expression. Attorney Vallejo, your opening arguments, please. The defense attorney stood up confidently. He presented his arguments clearly, logically, and professionally, everything that Valerie had utterly failed to do. The stark contrast between the two was simply abysmal. When he had finished, I reviewed my notes carefully. I thoroughly analyzed all the pertinent documents. And then I said something that I knew would completely destroy Valerie. Attorney Logan, I have carefully reviewed the documents you presented, and I have noted several significant inconsistencies. The dates on some of the contracts do not match the timelines presented in the testimonies you mentioned. The amounts you are claiming are not adequately backed up by the attached invoices, and there are at least 3 separate clauses that your argument directly contradicts. I paused for dramatic effect. I looked directly at her. Can you please explain these inconsistencies to the court? Valerie stood up awkwardly. She opened and closed her mouth several times, as if struggling to find the right words. She searched desperately through her scattered papers, but she had no answers because the simple truth was that she had only prepared the case halfway, arrogantly confident in her ability to improvise, to manipulate, to win through sheer audacity instead of diligent hard work. I would need to review my files, Your Honor. You should have reviewed your files before coming to my courtroom, Attorney Logan. This court does not tolerate professional negligence. The ensuing silence was absolutely crushing. Everyone in the courtroom knew exactly what had just transpired. Valerie Logan, the arrogant and self-assured lawyer who thought she was invincible, had just been publicly exposed as completely incompetent by a judge who, as it turned out, was also her own mother-in-law. Charles suddenly jumped to his feet. He practically ran out of the courtroom. The heavy door slammed shut behind him with a dry, echoing bang. Valerie watched him leave, and in her eyes, I saw something that I had never seen before. Real, unadulterated fear, because she knew that Charles had just understood everything. that his mother was not at all who he thought she was, and that his wife had just thoroughly humiliated herself in front of the very woman they had both been plotting to destroy. We will take a recess of 30 minutes. When we return, I expect both parties to be fully prepared to proceed with the utmost professionalism. This hearing will resume promptly at 11 o'clock. I banged the gavel sharply against the desk. The sound reverberated through the courtroom like a clap of thunder. Court is recessed. The courtroom slowly emptied. Valerie remained seated, motionless, with a completely lost and vacant gaze. Her assistant tried to talk to her, but she didn't respond. I stepped down from the bench. I walked purposefully toward my temporary office, my back ramrod straight and my head held high. Every step resonated crisply in the otherwise empty hallway. And as I walked, I felt something that I hadn't felt in years. Power, dignity, and the absolute certainty that this was only just the beginning. The 30-minute recess felt like an eternity. I sat alone in the small office that Patricia had prepared for me, looking out the window toward the courthouse parking lot. From my vantage point, I could see Charles pacing anxiously next to his car, his cell phone glued to his ear. He gestured wildly with his free hand. He ran his fingers distractedly through his hair. He looked utterly desperate. Patricia came into the office carrying a steaming cup of hot tea. "How do you feel, Mrs. Parker?" "Like I just woke up after sleeping for 3 long years." She smiled sadly. "The whole courtroom is buzzing. No one can believe that you are Valerie Logan's mother-in-law. Some of the younger attorneys didn't even realize that you had been a judge here." I slowly sipped the tea, feeling the comforting warmth spread down my throat. Outside, Charles had stopped pacing. He was now sitting slumped on the hood of his car with his head buried in his hands, completely alone and utterly broken. A part of me desperately wanted to go out there, to hug him tightly, to reassure him that everything would somehow be okay. But another part of me, the part that had fiercely awakened when I first read that message, knew that this was absolutely necessary, that I simply couldn't continue being the meek and self-effacing mother who made herself small so that they could feel big. Patricia approached the window and followed my gaze. "Do you think he even knew who you were?" "No. Charles never asked about my job. He was never truly interested in knowing what I did when I wasn't directly with him. When he graduated from college, I was already a respected judge, but he was so incredibly busy building his own career that he never really looked back. He never saw the woman who had sacrificed everything so that he could have that career. It must have hurt you a lot." "It did hurt, for years, but now it doesn't hurt anymore. Now I only feel absolute clarity." The clock chimed softly, marking the time as 10:50. It was time to go back. Patricia helped me adjust the heavy black robe. I looked at myself one last time in the small mirror hanging on the wall. The eyes that looked back at me were no longer those of a broken and defeated woman. They were the eyes of a judge, the eyes of someone who had finally recovered her long-lost identity. I returned to the courtroom through the same side hallway. When I entered, everyone was already back in their places. Valerie had managed to regain some semblance of composure. She had touched up her makeup. She had straightened her back, but her eyes still betrayed that barely contained sense of panic. Charles had returned as well. He was sitting in the same seat as before, but now he looked at me differently, no longer with complete indifference, but now with something that I couldn't quite decipher. Astonishment, shame, fear. I walked back up to the bench. I sat down deliberately. I banged the gavel sharply once. "Court is back in session. Attorney Logan, you have the floor. I sincerely hope that you used the recess to better organize your arguments." Valerie stood up. This time, she was carrying a new folder, one that her assistant had surely prepared for her during the recess. She took a deep breath and began to speak with more control than before. "Your Honor, my client fulfilled all of the obligations that were stipulated in the contract. They delivered the materials on the agreed-upon dates. Payments were made according to the established schedule. However, the defendant did not fulfill its fundamental obligation to begin construction within the 90-day period that was explicitly established in Clause 7-3. Better, much better than before. But I had already thoroughly reviewed the entire case during the recess. I knew every single detail, every single weak point in her revised argument. I listened to her intently for 15 minutes. I took meticulous notes. And when she finally finished, I began to ask the questions. Specific questions, pointed questions, questions that any judge would ask in a case like this. Nothing personal, just strictly professional conduct. Attorney Logan, you mentioned that your client fulfilled all obligations. However, according to the site engineer's testimony, which appears on page 42 of the documents, there was a 3-week delay in the delivery of materials. Can you explain that discrepancy? I couldn't help but notice Valerie frantically searching for that page. The way her hands trembled as she flipped through the sheets. The way her confidence seemed to crumble all over again. That delay was due to circumstances beyond my client's control. Your Honor. Problem with the supplier. Do you have documentation to support that statement? I would have to review that. Attorney Logan, I remind you that this is a trial, not an informal meeting. You are expected to have all necessary documentation readily available. If you do not have it, please state that clearly. I do not have that documentation at this moment, Your Honor. Then your argument that your client fulfilled all obligations remains unsupported by evidence. Please continue with your other points. Valerie's face flushed crimson with shame, a clear attempt to suppress her rage. But she was powerless to act. She was in my courtroom operating under my rules. And those rules applied equally to everyone. The defense attorney, Cesar Vallejo, skillfully exploited every one of Valerie's missteps. He presented irrefutable evidence, corroborated testimonies, and signed contracts that directly contradicted her claims. He was a seasoned professional facing an opponent who had placed excessive faith in her own hubris. After 2 hours of testimony, I felt I had gathered sufficient information. Both parties had presented their cases exhaustively. Now it was time for deliberation. We will take a recess of 1 hour. After that time, I will deliver my verdict. Court is recessed. I brought the gavel down with a resounding thud. The courtroom began to empty. Valerie remained seated, her head bowed in defeat. Her assistant spoke to her in a hushed tone, but she didn't seem to register his presence. Charles approached her tentatively and placed his hand on her shoulder. Valerie looked up and uttered something I couldn't quite make out, but I witnessed Charles shake his head almost imperceptibly. The way he withdrew his hand struck me. It was the first time in years he didn't instinctively take her side. I retreated to my chambers. Louise Oliver was waiting for me there. She had been present throughout the hearing, sitting unobtrusively in the last row. Mrs. Parker, you handled it perfectly. Professional, impartial. No one can accuse you of acting with favoritism or malice. I acted solely in accordance with the law, Louise, as I always have. I understand, but I also know this must be incredibly difficult for you. It involves your family. It was my family. Now I'm not sure what they are anymore. Louise placed the thick folder containing all the evidence we had painstakingly collected on my desk. The fraud, the debts, the forged mortgage, everything. Are you going to use this information? Not today. Today, I'm just going to perform my duty as a judge. I'm going to deliver a verdict based solely on the evidence presented in court. Nothing more, nothing less. And afterward, we'll see. But they need to understand that they can't continue to play games with me. That I'm not the defenseless old woman they assumed I was. I spent that hour meticulously reviewing every document associated with the case once more, taking detailed notes, carefully analyzing the arguments presented by both sides. And even though Valerie was part of my family, even though every emotional fiber of my being yearned to punish her for the pain she had inflicted upon me, my duty as a judge took precedence. The evidence was unequivocal. Valerie's case was riddled with glaring holes, inconsistencies she couldn't adequately explain, and a conspicuous lack of crucial documentation. Her client was the party who had breached the contract first, despite her vehement assertions to the contrary. I reached my decision. I committed it to writing on 2 pages, clearly worded, thoroughly substantiated, and, above all, fair. When the clock struck 1 p.m., I returned to the courtroom. Everyone was already present, waiting with bated breath. The silence was palpable. Valerie had her fists clenched tightly on the table, her knuckles white. Charles appeared ashen, almost spectral. I took my seat on the bench. I brought the gavel down with a single, decisive strike. I have carefully reviewed all the evidence presented by both parties. I have analyzed the testimonies, the contracts, and the accompanying documentation, and I have reached a definitive conclusion. I paused for effect, allowing the tension in the room to build. I looked directly at Valerie, meeting her gaze unflinchingly. The plaintiff, represented by attorney Valerie Logan, has failed to demonstrate with sufficient evidence that the defendant breached the contract. On the contrary, the evidence presented by the defense convincingly demonstrates that it was the plaintiff who breached the contract first by failing to deliver the materials within the established deadlines. Therefore, this court rules in favor of the defendant. The claim is dismissed in its entirety. The costs associated with this suit will be borne by the plaintiff. The resounding crack of the gavel echoed like a thunderclap through the silent courtroom. Valerie visibly crumbled, both figuratively and literally. Her body slumped forward onto the table. Her assistant had to physically support her to prevent her from falling. She had suffered a crushing defeat. And she hadn't just lost the case. She had lost something far more valuable, her professional reputation, because everyone in that courtroom now knew that she had been utterly vanquished by her own mother-in-law, the filthy old woman she had so callously humiliated that very morning. Charles had his hands pressed tightly against his face, as if attempting to shield himself from the harsh reality of the situation. His shoulders were shaking with suppressed emotion, and I, sitting in my judge's chair, my robe and my dignity completely intact, felt only one thing, a profound sense of peace. The courtroom slowly emptied, the occupants dispersing in various states of shock and disappointment. The defense attorney shook his client's hand with a satisfied smile, clearly pleased with the outcome. Assistants efficiently gathered documents and prepared to depart. Security personnel held the doors open for people to exit. But Valerie remained rooted to her spot, sitting motionless with her gaze fixed on some distant point on the wall. Charles eventually approached her, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice. He attempted to take her arm to help her to her feet, but Valerie recoiled with a sharp, almost violent movement. She stood up unaided, swaying slightly on her high heels. Then she looked directly at me, and in her eyes, I saw something that transcended mere panic and shame. I saw pure, unadulterated hatred, raw and unmasked. She strode purposefully toward the bench, her expression a mask of fury. Her assistant frantically tried to intercept her, but she shrugged him off with a dismissive gesture. She ascended 2 of the 3 steps that separated her from me, her every movement radiating anger. The security guard took a step forward, prepared to intervene, but I raised my hand to signal him to stand down. Valerie stood there, glaring up at me from below, her face contorted with rage. This was premeditated. You did this on purpose. You've lied to us our entire lives. You never once told us you were a judge. Why? So you could humiliate me like this. Her voice trembled, but not with fear. It was vibrating with fury, a lifetime of contained rage that had finally exploded, shattering the facade of composure she had been forced to maintain in front of the witnesses. I didn't lie to anyone, Valerie. You simply never bothered to ask. My son never expressed any interest in knowing what I did for a living. You never showed any genuine curiosity about truly knowing me. You only cared that I was small, invisible, and easily dismissed as inconsequential. You're a manipulator. All this time, you've pretended to be a weak, helpless old woman so that we would let our guard down. I rose slowly from my seat, without haste. I looked down at her, my gaze unwavering. I didn't pretend to be weak. You assumed I was. There's a significant difference. And you didn't lose today because I sought revenge. You lost because you came to court ill-prepared. Because you relied on your arrogance and entitlement instead of hard work and thorough preparation. That defeat is entirely your own. Valerie clenched her fists so tightly that her knuckles turned white. For a fleeting moment, I thought she might actually attempt to strike me again. But the security guard moved closer, his presence a stark reminder that she was in a courtroom and that she was powerless to act. This is not over. I'm going to appeal this decision. I'm going to prove that there was a conflict of interest, that you should have recused yourself from hearing a case in which I was the attorney. Go ahead and appeal. But I feel compelled to warn you that the entire proceeding was meticulously recorded. Every word, every decision is documented for posterity, and any judge who reviews this case will inevitably reach the same conclusion. You lost because your case was fundamentally weak, not because I happened to be your mother-in-law. Valerie turned sharply and descended the steps. She strode toward the exit with rapid, agitated steps. Her assistant trailed behind her, burdened with all the heavy folders. When she reached the door, she paused abruptly and turned around one last time, her eyes blazing with resentment. Charles deserves better than a mother like you. The words, intended to wound me deeply, should have caused me pain. A few months prior, they would have devastated me, shattering me into a million pieces. But now they simply hung in the air, devoid of power, weightless, inconsequential. Charles deserves a mother who doesn't have to hide to be loved and a wife who doesn't manipulate him to get what she wants. But those are decisions he will have to make entirely on his own. Valerie slammed the door shut with a resounding crash that echoed through the now empty courtroom. Charles remained seated in his spot, motionless, as if he were paralyzed by indecision, unsure of what to do, where to go, or whom to believe. I stepped down from the bench, my movements slow and deliberate. I removed the heavy robe, folding it carefully over my arm. Patricia appeared at the door, her expression a mixture of concern and admiration. Do you need anything, Mrs. Parker? No, thank you, Patricia. I'm finished here. I walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I had to pass by Charles, who was still sitting there, lost in his thoughts. When I reached him, he slowly stood up, his gaze meeting mine for the first time in years. A genuine, unfiltered look, without Valerie acting as a barrier between us, without excuses, without lies. Mom. His voice cracked with emotion. I saw tears welling up in his eyes. But I didn't stop. Not yet. Because there were still things that desperately needed to be said. And this simply wasn't the right time or the right place. Charles, when you're ready to have a real conversation, you know where to find me. In that little house your wife is so ashamed of. In that house you're planning to sell out from under me without even bothering to ask. His face paled even further, his eyes widening in disbelief. How do you know about that? I saw Valerie's text message on your phone 6 months ago, declaring me legally incompetent, selling my house, putting me in a nursing home, all meticulously planned without my knowledge or consent. Charles recoiled as if I had physically struck him. It wasn't, she was just what, Charles? Planning my life without consulting me, stealing my dignity. And you were just going to allow it to happen without defending me, without even asking me if I agreed with her plans? He remained silent, unable to meet my gaze. He sank back into the chair, burying his face in his hands. I wanted to have this conversation at another time, when we both had more emotional bandwidth. I wanted to give you ample time to process everything you've just discovered about me. But you need to understand something right now, Charles. I am not the enemy here. I never have been. I was just a mother who loved her son so deeply that she made herself invisible, so as not to inconvenience him in any way. And that was my biggest mistake. Mom, I didn't know. I didn't know you were a judge. I didn't know how important you were. I didn't know anything about your life. Exactly. You didn't know because you never bothered to ask. Because you simply assumed that my life began and ended with being your mother. Because Valerie convinced you that I was a hindrance to your happiness, and you readily believed her. I draped the robe over my arm, my movements deliberate. I took a step toward the door, but Charles stopped me again, his voice filled with anguish. What am I going to do now, Mom? I turned to face him, my gaze softening as I looked at my son. The boy I had raised single-handedly, the man he had become, a man I scarcely recognized anymore. You're going to decide, Charles. You're going to decide if you want to continue being the kind of man who allows his wife to humiliate his own mother, or if you want to reclaim some semblance of the person you used to be. But that decision is entirely yours to make, not mine. I can no longer make those decisions for you. I exited the courtroom, leaving Charles to grapple with his conscience. Patricia was waiting for me in the hallway, her face etched with a sad smile. "You were incredible in there, Mrs. Parker. Everyone is talking about you, saying you're the same brilliant judge you always were." "I don't feel particularly brilliant at the moment, Patricia. I just feel tired." She embraced me warmly, and for the first time all day, I allowed myself to fully absorb the weight of what had just transpired, of what I had been compelled to do, of how I had publicly exposed my own family in front of complete strangers. But I also felt something else, something equally powerful. A sense that I had finally reclaimed something I had lost years ago. My voice, my identity, my power. Louise was waiting for me in the lobby, her presence a comforting reassurance. When she saw me, she smiled warmly. "Judge Parker, it was truly an honor to witness you in action again. Thank you, Louise, for everything, for helping me get to this point. What's next?" I reached into my purse and retrieved my cell phone. I dialed a number I had saved for months, the one for the court reporter at the local newspaper. She had covered many of my cases when I was still actively serving on the bench. She was intimately familiar with my reputation for fairness and integrity. She answered on the third ring, her voice filled with surprise and genuine warmth. "Judge Parker, I can't believe it's you. I thought you had completely retired from the bench." "I had, but today I returned to hear a rather special case, and I believe I have a story that might be of interest to you." I proceeded to tell her everything, carefully omitting overly personal details and focusing on the essential facts. A highly respected retired judge returning to the bench for a single day, an arrogant attorney who happens to be her daughter-in-law, a hearing where professionalism ultimately triumphed over arrogance, a fair and impartial verdict delivered despite strong family ties. The reporter listened intently, without interruption. I could clearly hear the sound of her pen scratching furiously on her notepad at the other end of the line, capturing every nuance of the story. "This is going on the front page tomorrow. It's exactly the kind of uplifting story people need to read right now. Just please make sure it's accurate. I don't want any unnecessary sensationalism or drama. Just stick to the unvarnished truth. The truth is dramatic enough on its own, Judge." I terminated the call, replacing the phone in my purse. Louise looked at me with a mixture of admiration and lingering concern. "Are you absolutely sure you want to make this public?" "Completely sure. Because if I don't control the narrative, Valerie certainly will. She's going to claim that I was unfair, that I abused my power as a judge, that I persecuted her out of personal revenge, and I'm simply not going to allow her to disseminate those lies unchallenged." We exited the courthouse together, stepping out into the warm afternoon sunlight. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, savoring the comforting warmth on my skin. When I opened them again, I noticed Charles standing next to his car across the street, alone and looking utterly despondent. Valerie was conspicuously absent. He looked at me from a distance, as if he wanted to approach but was unsure how to proceed. I returned his gaze, my expression unreadable, and then I turned and walked toward the taxi Louise had already summoned for me. I had spent 30 years of my life prioritizing Charles's needs, sacrificing my own desires, diminishing my own importance in the hope that he would finally see me for who I truly was. But today, for the first time in decades, I deliberately put my own needs first, and it felt liberating. The news story appeared prominently on the front page of the newspaper the very next morning. The headline was simple but forceful: "Retired judge returns to deliver justice in case involving her daughter-in-law as attorney." The photo accompanying the article was an image of me from my active years at the courthouse, resplendent in my judicial robe and wearing that characteristic, serious gaze I always adopted during hearings. The article itself was accurate, factual, and refreshingly free of sensationalism. It detailed my 30-year career as a judge, highlighting the significant cases I had resolved and emphasizing my impeccable reputation for fairness and impartiality. Then, it recounted the events of the previous day, explaining how Valerie Logan had suffered a crushing defeat in an important contract case before a judge who turned out to be her own mother-in-law. The article also made it clear that the entire hearing had been meticulously recorded and subsequently reviewed by other judges, who unanimously affirmed that the proceedings had been conducted with absolute impartiality and fairness. The reporter had also managed to obtain statements from other attorneys who had been present in the courtroom during the hearing. They all concurred on the same point. Attorney Logan had been demonstrably unprepared, her arguments were riddled with gaping holes, and the verdict had been entirely justified based solely on the evidence presented. My phone started ringing incessantly at 7 a.m., with former colleagues, fellow judges I had served with over the years, and even professors from my old law school all calling to congratulate me on my triumphant return to the bench. Everyone said they had missed me terribly and asked if I would ever consider coming back, even in a consulting capacity. At 9 a.m., the phone at Charles's law firm also began to ring off the hook, but those calls were of a decidedly different nature. Clients were demanding to know why Valerie Logan was still employed there after such a humiliating public defeat. Senior partners expressed deep concern about the damage to the firm's previously impeccable reputation, and young, ambitious associates were whispering nervously in the hallways, speculating about the fallout. Louise arrived at my house at 10 a.m., carrying yet another thick folder filled with troubling documents. This time, however, the documents weren't related to the courthouse case. They pertained to something far more serious and potentially devastating. Mrs. Parker, we need to have a serious discussion about what we've uncovered. We can't afford to delay any longer. She opened the folder on my kitchen table, revealing a disturbing collection of bank statements, wire transfers, emails, and other incriminating evidence of Valerie's fraudulent activities. The $50,000 she had illicitly diverted from the firm's accounts, the staggering amount of hidden debt she had accumulated, the forged mortgage she had surreptitiously placed on Charles's house, and much more. And that's not even the worst of it. I spoke with a friend who serves on the State Bar Ethics Board. Valerie already has 3 formal complaints pending against her, all alleging various forms of malpractice. Cases where she inexplicably failed to appear at scheduled hearings, clients she inexplicably failed to return calls to, and crucial legal documents she inexplicably failed to prepare. Does Charles have any idea about any of this? I sincerely doubt it. I've thoroughly reviewed everything, and it appears that Valerie managed the firm's finances completely on her own, without any oversight or input from Charles. He simply signed whatever documents she placed in front of him, never bothering to scrutinize them carefully. He trusted her implicitly until yesterday. Exactly until yesterday. My doorbell rang, its shrill chime shattering the somber silence. Louise and I exchanged knowing glances, our expressions mirroring our shared apprehension. I wasn't expecting any visitors. I cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. It was Charles. He was standing at my entrance, clutching the folded newspaper tightly under his arm. He had deep, dark circles under his eyes, a clear indication of sleeplessness. His suit was rumpled and disheveled, as if he had spent the night sleeping in it, if he had slept at all. I slowly opened the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Charles. Mom, can I come in? I stepped aside, allowing him to enter. He walked into the kitchen and stopped abruptly when he saw Louise sitting at the table, surrounded by the incriminating documents spread out before her. His face drained of all color, turning ashen and gaunt. What is all this? What's going on here? Louise began to gather the papers together, attempting to shield him from the disturbing truth, but I gently stopped her. Leave them where they are, Louise. Charles has a right to know the truth. My son hesitantly approached the table, his movements slow and deliberate. He stared at the documents, his eyes darting from one item to the next, trying to make sense of the numbers, the dates, the emails. He reached out and picked up one document, then another, his hands beginning to tremble uncontrollably. This is from the firm. These are our accounts. Why do you have these documents? Why are they here? Because I needed to protect myself, Charles. When I discovered that you and Valerie were planning to have me declared legally incompetent and sell my house out from under me, I hired Louise to conduct an investigation, and we uncovered far more than we ever anticipated. Charles read silently for several minutes, his brow furrowed in concentration. I watched him closely, silently observing as his expression gradually changed from confusion to disbelief and then to utter horror. $50,000. She took $50,000 from the firm without my knowledge. And this mortgage. My signature is right here, but I never signed this document. It's a forgery, Louis said softly, his voice filled with sympathy. Valerie mortgaged your house without your consent, Charles. She then used that money to pay off her own personal debts. Charles slumped heavily into a chair, his body seeming to deflate before my eyes. He dropped the papers onto the table as if they were burning his skin. I can't believe this. All this time, I thought we were building something together, something real and lasting. I actually believed that she loved me. I sat down in the chair across from him, my gaze unwavering. We were finally alone together, without Valerie acting as an intermediary, without lies, without pretense. Charles, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Whatever it is, Mom, you can ask me anything. Did you really believe that I was losing my mind? Did you really want to have me declared incompetent? Or was it all her idea? He looked up at me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. She told me that you were starting to lose your memory, that you were forgetting things, that one day she found you wandering around in the street, confused and disoriented, and you didn't even remember how you had gotten there. She said that you were becoming a danger to yourself and that having you declared incompetent was the only way to ensure your own safety and well-being. That never happened, Charles. Not a single word of it is true. My mind is perfectly sound. In fact, I have recent medical evaluations that definitively prove it. Valerie invented all of that nonsense to manipulate you into believing that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. But why, Mom? Why would she do something so cruel and deceitful? I showed him the documents detailing her overwhelming debts, the expired loans, the increasingly desperate threats of foreclosure, the harassing calls from debt collectors. Because she needed money desperately, Charles, and my house is worth $200,000. Selling it was her only hope for salvation. But in order to get her hands on that money, she first had to get me completely out of the way. Charles buried his face in his hands, his body racked with sobs. My God, what have I done? I abandoned you, Mom. I left you all alone. I allowed her to treat you like trash. And all this time you are a judge, a highly respected professional, a woman who sacrificed everything to give me a better life. Yes, Charles, that's exactly what I am. Why did you never tell me any of this? Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, for being your mother, not for being important, not for having a prestigious title, just for being me. But I was wrong. I should have told you the truth from the very beginning. Silence descended upon the kitchen, heavy and suffocating. Louise had remained quiet and unobtrusive, sensing that we needed space to navigate this difficult conversation. Finally, Charles spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you going to do with all of this, Mom? With all of this evidence of fraud, with the forgery? That decision is entirely yours to make, Charles. You are her husband. You are her partner in the firm. If you present this evidence to the authorities, Valerie will inevitably lose her license to practice law. She will probably face serious criminal charges as well. And your professional reputation will undoubtedly suffer as a result, simply because you are her partner. But if you don't do anything, she will inevitably continue to destroy everything she touches. I don't know what to do, Mom. I need some time to think this through. You don't have much time, Charles. The state bar auditors are already reviewing the firm because of the mounting complaints against Valerie. They will inevitably uncover the missing money eventually. It's better if you come forward voluntarily and disclose everything before they do. Charles stood up abruptly and walked over to the window. He stared blankly outside, his gaze unfocused, as if he didn't really see anything. I loved her, Mom. Or at least I thought I loved her. Now, I don't even know what was real and what was a lie. I approached him and placed my hand gently on his shoulder. He felt thinner and more fragile than I remembered, as if he had shrunk somehow. Sometimes the people we love are not who we think they are, and accepting that harsh reality hurts more than anything else in the world. But you have to make a choice, son. Are you going to protect her, or are you going to protect yourself? Charles turned to look at me, his eyes searching mine for guidance. And in that moment, I saw the boy again. He was scared, lost, and desperately seeking direction. "What would you do in my situation, Mom?" "I've already made my decision, Charles. I protected myself. I defended myself against her deceit and manipulation. And in doing so, I finally recovered my long-lost dignity. Now it's your turn to do the same." He nodded slowly, his expression hardening with resolve. He gathered the documents from the table, his movements decisive. He tucked them securely under his arm. "I'm going to talk to the auditors first thing in the morning. I'm going to hand over everything to them. And I'm going to divorce Valerie." The words sounded firm and resolute, devoid of any lingering uncertainty. For the first time in years, my son was making a difficult decision entirely on his own, without being unduly influenced by Valerie. "What about the girls, Charles?" I asked softly. "The girls are finally going to meet their real grandmother. Not the tiny, insignificant little old lady that Valerie wanted you to believe I was. They're going to meet the real woman. The judge, the fighter, the survivor." Charles stepped forward and embraced me tightly. A long, heartfelt hug, filled with years of accumulated distance and deep regret. "Forgive me, Mom, for everything." I returned his embrace, feeling how something deep inside me, something that had been broken for so long, was finally beginning to heal. 3 months later, my life was almost unrecognizably different. Charles presented all the evidence of Valerie's fraudulent activities to the state bar and to the appropriate law enforcement authorities. Valerie lost her license to practice law permanently. She faced multiple criminal charges, including forgery, embezzlement, and fraud. Charles made the difficult decision to dissolve their firm. The firm had to temporarily close while a thorough audit was conducted. Charles managed to salvage the practice by completely separating himself from Valerie, making restitution for the stolen money with his own personal savings, and pledging to operate with complete transparency moving forward. The divorce proceedings were remarkably swift and uncontested. Valerie simply didn't have the resources to put up a fight. Her professional reputation was irrevocably tarnished. Her mounting debts continued to pursue her relentlessly. And worst of all, she had completely lost the manipulative control she had always exerted over Charles. I deliberately chose not to attend any of the divorce hearings, not because I didn't care about the outcome, but because it was no longer my battle to fight. I had already won. It was Charles's burden, and he needed to face it on his own. But what I did do was open the doors of my house, literally. One Saturday afternoon, Charles arrived with Natalie and Olivia, my granddaughters. It was the first time I had seen them in over a year. Natalie was 10 years old now, and Olivia was 8, 2 beautiful girls with curious eyes and shy smiles. "Girls, this is your grandmother, the real grandmother." Natalie looked at me with fascination. She had read the newspaper article. Charles had shown it to her. "Were you really a judge, Grandma? For real?" "I really was for 30 years. And yes, I decided who won and who lost." I knelt down to their level. "Well, not exactly like that. I listened to both sides of the story. I reviewed all the evidence, and then I made the fairest decision according to the law." Olivia, the younger one, approached timidly. "Mommy always said that you weren't important." I took her little hand in mine. "Your mommy was wrong about a lot of things, but that doesn't matter anymore. What does matter is that now we can get to know each other. Would you like that?" They both nodded. And that day I baked cookies with them. I showed them photos of Charles when he was a little boy. I told them stories about their grandfather, Michael. I even talked to them about some of the cases I had resolved, adapting the stories to be age-appropriate, of course. And for the first time in years, my house was filled with laughter, with life, with a real sense of family. Charles stayed quiet most of the time, just watching, with tears in his eyes that he discreetly wiped away when he thought no one was looking. Before they left, he gave me a hug at the door. "Thank you, Mom, for not giving up, for being stronger than all of us put together." I wasn't strong, Charles. I just stopped pretending to be weak. The following weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely we built something new. Charles started coming to dinner on Sundays with the girls. We really talked about his work, about his fears, about how to rebuild his life. And I also started rebuilding mine. I agreed to give some guest lectures at the law school on judicial ethics, on how to maintain impartiality even in personally difficult situations. The students listened to me with respect, with admiration. I also agreed to work as a mediator in family dispute cases. It turned out that my personal experience had given me a unique perspective. I could see both sides of the issue, understand the pain of abandoned parents, and the confusion of manipulated children. Louis became a close friend. We had lunch together once a week. We talked about cases, about life, about second chances. One day he said something I'll never forget. "Mrs. Parker, when I met you 20 years ago, you gave me my life back. Now I feel honored to have helped you recover yours." Patricia also came back into my life. She had retired from the courthouse, but we met for coffee. She filled me in on all the gossip about the new judges. I told her about my granddaughters and, well, about Valerie. Valerie had disappeared from our lives. I heard she had moved to another city and was working on something that didn't require a law license. I didn't feel any satisfaction hearing that, only a distant sadness for all the potential she had wasted because of greed and arrogance. 6 months after that day in the courthouse, I received an official letter. It was from the Judicial Systems Board of Directors. They were offering me a position as a consultant judge, a special role created specifically for me. I would only work 2 days a week. I would review complex cases and advise young judges. Charles was with me when I opened the letter. He read it over my shoulder. "Are you going to accept?" I looked at the letter, then I looked at him. "What do you think?" "I think you should do whatever makes you happy, Mom. You've spent enough time living for other people." I accepted the position, and on the first day I returned to the courthouse, this time officially and not just for a special case. I walked through those hallways with my head held high. I greeted old colleagues, I met the new ones, and I sat in my office with my name on the door. Judge Agnes Parker, Judicial Consultant. That afternoon, when I got home, I found a bouquet of flowers at my door. The card read, "Because it's never too late to bloom again. With love, Charles, Natalie, and Olivia." I sat in my living room, the same room where I had spent so many nights alone and broken, and I cried. But they weren't tears of pain this time. They were tears of liberation, of closure, of a new beginning. I thought about everything that had happened. The humiliation at the courthouse door, the years of silence and pain, the moment I decided that enough was enough, Valerie's look when she saw me sitting in the judge's chair. And I thought about who I was now. No longer the invisible mother who made herself small to be loved. No longer the woman who hid her achievements like shameful secrets. Now I was simply Agnes, complete, whole, unapologetic. My phone rang. It was Natalie calling on a video call. "Grandma, can you help me with my homework? It's about the judicial system." "Of course, my love. Tell me what you need." As I explained the 3 branches of government to her, I smiled because this was what I had always wanted. Not to be feared for my title, not to be respected for my power, just to be known, to be seen, to be loved for who I really was. That night, before going to sleep, I looked at myself in the mirror. 71 years old, gray hair, wrinkles that told stories, but also eyes that shone with renewed life, with a recovered purpose. I spoke to myself softly, as I had done so many times in the dark days. But this time, the words were different. "My name is Agnes Parker. I was a judge for 30 years. I raised my son alone. I survived abandonment. I survived betrayal. And I didn't just survive. I was reborn. My name is no longer just that of mother, that of mother-in-law, that of the old woman who is in the way. My name is mine again, and my story is just beginning."